This is Future Sense Now, where we explore the landscape and byways of our shared futures. Future Sense Now is brought to you by the Futures Forum. Stay tuned for a journey to the futures of women with host Dr. Claire Nelson.
Greetings and welcome to Future Sense Now, an online e-zine of the Futures Forum. I am Claire Nelson and your travel guide on today's exploration of the future. It is March 2017 and we're celebrating Women's History Month with our exploration of the future history of women. Specifically, we want to look at the years 2030 and beyond. And we begin with 2030 because, as we might know, the UN and the world has 17 Sustainable Development Goals ranging from ending poverty to sustainable cities. And there is one goal specifically about the equality for women and girls. It's SDG 5. And so a lot of women around the world working in different NGOs and governments, etc., are focused around this. And today we're simply talking to some futurists who may have their own ideas of what might emerge. So I will be speaking today to, and now comes the challenge. I'm going to try to pronounce this name properly. It is IVANIA MILOJEVIC. IVANIA MILOJEVIC. How am I?
Very close. Very close.
Okay, let me say that I was coached yesterday by Dr. Patricia Kelly, who said to me that people in America say Ivana, but that's not the correct pronunciation. So,
that's correct. Yeah, we stress things differently.
It's Ivana. So Ivana.
Yeah.
So Dr. Ivana is a well-known researcher, writer, and educator in the area of future studies, along with gender, peace, education, sociology. She's been running workshops and speeches for governments and NGOs and teaching universities from the early 90s. Indeed, for me, she is a legend. I have her name being one of the first names I came across when I started my journey to the future back in 2004. Dr. Ivana is the author of over 70 journals. She is the editor and co-editor of a number of academic books. Indeed, the pedagogy itself of how we think about the future, a lot of it comes out of her work and her research. What is exciting is that I am speaking to her today from Brunei, Dar es Salaam. Now, she's going to tell me exactly where on the map that is. I do not want to be ignorant. I think the Kingdom of Brunei, if I'm correct, but where exactly in Asia, I would love to be more specific. And where she's leading foresight initiatives for the Center for Strategic and Policy Studies, which is a government-funded think tank. So I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Ivana and begin our conversation by saying good morning for me and good afternoon for you, I think tomorrow. I'm not sure exactly if you're tomorrow or today. How are you?
I'm really well, Claire. Thank you so much. Thank you for the lovely introduction and thank you for calling me to discuss these issues. I'm currently in Brunei. It's 9:30 p.m. It's your time, 8:30 a.m. in Washington. So we are in different time, but the same day. So Brunei is the same day.
Brunei
Thursday.
is exactly where? Is the Brunei near to India, Singapore? Where is it?
Yeah, well, it's very interesting because lots of people think it's in the Middle East. And I had to educate myself when I found out I was coming here. So it's in Southeast Asia, Brunei Darussalam, the abode of peace. Darussalam means the abode of peace, and indeed is a very peaceful country. It is located on the island, the third largest island in the world, I learned, 3.5 times bigger than Britain, UK. So it's called Borneo, the island, and that's where Brunei is.
Wait, so
Southeast Asia.
So it's near to Vietnam?
South of Vietnam, east of Singapore, north of Australia.
But it's bigger than the United Kingdom.
Well, Borneo as an island is 3.5 times bigger than UK. which is also
Wow.
an island. Yeah, I know. I was surprised too because I thought it's this little island in the Pacific, even though it is relatively close to Australia. And even I flew through Brunei many years ago, but I just never. Brunei is 1% of Borneo, though. It is surrounded by Malaysia and Indonesia. So
Wow.
Borneo, yes, Borneo is mostly Indonesian, and then parts are Malaysian, and Brunei is this little thing in the middle, surrounded by Malaysia and facing South China Sea.
Wow, this is very exciting. So,
It is.
what I am very excited about hearing about the Center for Foresight, Strategic and Foresight Studies in the government. And today we're talking about the futures of women, and I'm using the SDG 5 as a sort of backdrop. It's all very familiar to you, I'm sure. So, tell me about what is happening in Brunei, why they would decide to set up a center for strategic and foresight studies that's funded by the government. Because certainly in my little island of Jamaica, where I am from, I have been trying to harass them for the last 4 years to do so. No, not 4 years, 3 years, and I've gotten nowhere so far. So tell me, what made them decide to take this route?
Yeah, I'm just trying to send you something. I think it will be interesting for you if the file goes through, and then we can open it. And you can here compare US to Brunei. It may be interesting to you and people, where you are based. It says if Brunei were your home instead of the United States, you would be 64% less likely to be unemployed, spend 89% less money on healthcare, be 80% less likely to be in prison, and so on and so forth. So it's some very interesting statistics, and indeed Brunei is a very developed country. But the development here and wealth, it's GDP per capita is higher than the US. I think they are number 13 now. They used to be quite high up there. But its wealth largely comes from oil and non-renewable resources, and it's going to deplete. And indeed, I think 20, 25 years from now, there will be depletion of oil and the main source for economy. So they are aware that they need to look into the future and change where they get their revenue.
Or how they made the revenue they have last indefinitely. That might be another opportunity. So this is a good place to start. So it means that they have had wealth to work with.
Yes.
I assume it's a Muslim country. Is it a state Islam, or is it a secular Islamic state?
It's actually absolute monarchy. It's Malay Muslim monarchy, which is in the process of introducing Sharia law as well. So it's a very interesting place. It's certainly very different to most Western countries. And there are some advantages being a small country and having very strong leadership that does not change with election cycles, which is that you can have long-term vision. Brunei is one of the rare countries, I believe, that has national vision, and they do have something called Wawasan 2035, which is looking ahead and trying to set up certain vision and certain goals far into the future.
So it's a monarchy, that's number one. But
absolute monarchy. Absolute, yes. Sorry?
Absolute monarchy, which is different.
So the Sultan is the prime minister as well, yes.
So they don't have a prime minister there.
They don't have elections.
So
they do have a prime minister, but
the Netherlands or Spain, they have elections. Got you. All right. Yes. So this is good. Now, is it an absolute monarchy also is an Islamic monarchy?
Yes, it's Malay Muslim monarchy. That's the system here.
So this is very interesting. So we're talking about a culture that might have a particular construct, and in your ideology, the way you teach us to think about the futures, you very much start with the idea of myth and where we are as a place to always be concerned with. So tell me, where then in this 2035 vision that they're working with, do they place the issue of women?
I think issue of women is invisible in this vision. I think so, to a large degree it is. It is encompassed under the vision of societal progress and moving as a society forward. But anyhow, I'm not an expert on Brunei. I've been working in the area of futures and gender studies, and actually I'm a recent arrival here. I've just been here for 6-7 months, so I don't really know that much about Brunei, and I'm trying to work with local people, work with researchers at my center, a number of women as well, to try to see how can we get foresight initiatives going. So it's largely about foresight, and it's not much about gender, although some of our researchers are looking into gender issues and women's issues into the future.
So, in other words, it's invisible, and at this point we're not sure exactly as a culture if they intend to remove it from the general picture of the future and make it its own, let's say, entity. Because one of the things that we talk about sometimes as futurists in terms of systems thinking, as we look at global challenges, because we are really having a global conversation today, and not about Brunei per se, but I just wanted to place this particular perspective into the conversation, because you're the only person that I'm speaking to in this series this year, or ever in the last 3 years since I've been doing this conversation, that has ever spoken to, that has actually worked in a culture with this particular lens. I'm really kind of curious how, as we look at the global future of women, how you might have this kind of a wild card out here that's doing something completely different, but at the same time might be completely happy, comfortable, and pleased if indeed we're saying we're doing this because we want to create thriving societies where people feel actualized. If indeed in this particular culture people feel actualized and it's thriving in 2035, even if they were to do, let's say, a futures exercise, it might be a very different story that they would create of what 2030 success looks like. And so,
Yes.
I know it's probably early days yet, but I'm curious as to, given this context then, how would you begin to frame the UN conversation around, from your perspective, the future? And you have worked in many countries. You've worked in Taiwan, you've worked in Australia. So how would you look at issues such as full and effective participation and equal opportunity for leadership is one. Universal access to sexual and reproductive rights is another big target issue. And the right to economic resources. So let's look at those three: leadership rights, economic rights, and health rights. First of all, how do you see that unfolding in that side of the world where you mostly have been doing work, in Southeast Asia and Asia?
Mm-hmm. Well, there is certainly a rise in rights of women in many parts of the world, and there is also backlash as well happening parallel to that. You are very well aware that in the Western society we have both forces simultaneously occurring. So Brunei is not different in that regard. And if I look at, I think it's in a gender, Brunei Global Gender Index, we can see that in terms of the economic participation and opportunity, there is countries ranked 56, and educational attainment is 70 out of 145 countries, but health and survival and political empowerment are lower. In fact, political empowerment is only 141 in terms of the ranking. So, there is diversity. This is what you get when you travel around the world and when you live in different countries and when you study historical times and when you study future projections and you look at throughout time and throughout space, you can just see a huge diversity amongst humans and the way we organize our gender relationships. Most people think about gender in terms of their local gender regimes. So they see something that is around them as universal or God-given or something that's been around us since times immemorial and so on and so forth. However, the world is very rich in this sense that there is diversity and that people achieve similar goals in very different ways.
Yes,
Yes.
because so let's look at the issue of leadership because I think it's a very interesting construct. Perhaps there is another way for us to view um, uh, full and effective participation in the context of what makes a thriving society. So the SDGs are written from a particular lens of what um, of human rights lens and gender rights lens that assumes that to feel as if you are thriving and to be fully actualized, you have to have this right to equal seats at the table. Um,
Mm.
so let's say in Asia where you have a lot of, if not a monarchy, you have dictatorships, you have other types of parliaments that are not maybe say as open as maybe some of the ones in the West or in Africa where they actually have quotas now for women in some countries. Uh, how what are you hearing in terms of the women's leaders you would have come across in terms of how they what are they hoping for and even if they can't say it publicly privately what are they hoping for and how are they constructing a vision of the future of women.
Yeah, well, that's not something I've done specifically in the context of Brunei, Asia, or Southeast Asia. So my knowledge here is limited. I haven't done any interviews. I haven't done any specific readings. So that's really not an area that I would feel very comfortable going into. What
Okay.
I can get, the sense I get from here is that women I work with don't feel or don't raise any issue around gender discrimination too much. In fact, the chief researcher at our center is a woman, and there are lots of women that are part of working environment, that are in government, that are employed by the government. The only thing that I notice here differently is that there is more accommodation for family life. So people
That's
go,
interesting.
they have approximately 1.5 hours lunch break. So they have lunch with their families. They pick
Wow.
up children from school. They have 4 peak hours. So they try to embrace family life more so. Like in Western societies, when you're working in the organization, you're expected not to have family life, not to have the body. I mean, you can't be
Wow.
feeling uncomfortable. You can't be being impeded in any ways by your whatever's going on in your life. In a private sphere, you need to just be this rational, kind of very productive, achievement-based and oriented person. In this part of the world, I noticed that family life becomes part of the fabric of who you are, and you bring that into your work, and somehow that becomes part of like more communal way to look at how life and work are organized.
That's very interesting. I'm wondering if that might have anything to do with the way they modernized without, let's say, a huge indigenous industrialization process. And so whoever were the, let's say, the people who came in to exploit the oil or the minerals were always considered outsiders, and so their ways weren't adopted. So when they adopted, let's say, the work day that moved from the field to the, let's say, offices, then they kind of moved the way they worked in the fields where they would stop to take lunch or stop to take care of children, and they moved that to the offices because it's the same thing. It's a work where you're not moving around plants and weeds, you're moving around, papers and weeds. And so that's very interesting. So as you look at it then, based on, I know you also lived in Taiwan, right? You lived in Taiwan for a while?
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
yes.
So based on that, as you think about the future of women, and one of the things that I'm using to sort of inform this whole series I'm doing is the scenarios that were done back in 1994 by a grad student at the Hawaii Futures Institute who wrote a paper, and he had 5 scenarios. One was continued growth, unisex era, separation, backlash, and partnership model. So what have you been using sort of, is it similar to what you've been perhaps using in your gender studies area about how you might see the future emerging, or are there other scenarios that you have come up with. This also was very much the same scenarios that the book that came out in 1990 spoke to. Have you come up with anything different from these ones which are more popularly known?
Yes, well, you see, I really enjoy that's Chris Jones's article, I believe, and there was a little bit of a backlash because one of the scenarios had an image. I mean, the scenarios were accompanied by image of Mona Lisa in 5 different areas, and the image portraying Mona Lisa within backlash scenario had like a chain collar and blue eyes, and so it was of a woman being brutalized, and there was a little bit of a backlash by women futurists at that time because they felt, how can you even portray this as an image? But it is one scenario that there are 5, and those are very interesting scenarios, and I think they're really important to see what are our options for the future, because that's how we can make better decisions for in the present moment, because futures thinking is always about making decisions in the present moment. So it's really important to not think in terms of one future, but in terms of multiple futures. And both those works that you mentioned are really important because they opened up various avenues to look at what may be different futures for our gender relationships, or for women and men, and so on and so forth. Now, gender studies as a field has kind of moved a little bit away from this binary women and men dichotomy. We are in the field, there is less focus on women and men as they are, these two groups, but more on us not being women and men, but doing maleness and femininity and masculinity. So that has been a large kind of move to start thinking about performativity of gender. And you get that sense when you live in different countries, when you live in different places, that it's just all basically made up in a way. Certainly there is certain structure. Certainly we have female and male bodies, but we also have bodies in between. And the way we organize our relationships, it's multiple. So you have all these genders in between. So my work was looking more at the futures of gender and looking at those 3 type of scenarios. So I did write a number of pieces where I looked at how that may, play out in the future, and have come up with 3 scenarios, which I thought are interesting because they are linked with what type of the world we want. And we know from feminist and women's movement, the visions have been there for a long time. The type of the world we want is the world where hierarchies are dismantled, where there is equal opportunity, where there is fairness, when there is justice, and so on and so forth. So how do you achieve that type of society? You achieve that type of society by changing the structure, but you can't just change gender and gender relations and empower one gender at the expense of the other. It has to be more holistic and more systemic, because we also know from intersectionality that women and men, they're just not these 2 separate categories. Certainly they can be different interest groups, and certainly there is a scenario where 2 genders are very separate, but at the same time class, race, ethnicity, ability, and so on and so forth plays a role in how different women and different men play out within the system. So we have all these multiple hierarchies that overlap, and the goal of feminist and women's movement was to address them all, not just hierarchies based on gender, but also based on class, based on ethnicity, race, and so on and so forth. So the scenarios I looked at were really to serve, to kind of connect with that broader vision. So if this is the desired future, how do we need to reform our gender relationships and our current gender regimes to achieve that vision? And my conclusion was from my study that it needs to be something along the lines of recognition of multiple gender diversities, because that is the reality of this world. You do have 3rd gender historically everywhere. Not everybody behaves in heteronormative terms, meaning that if you are born with certain kind of physiology, you will have certain identity, female physiology, then female identity, feminine behavior, and desiring a male partner. That is not always the case. In fact, at many levels, that is not the case. So there is and the same thing with men, so and males. So there is a vast diversity of human expression in terms of how we do gender, how we do maleness, how we do masculinity, how we do femininity. That's always been the case. Now, if you have societies that acknowledge that diversity, you're going to have democratic and open societies, and societies that incorporate this diversity in terms of allowing it expression. If, on the other hand, you insist on female-male polarity or unisex androgyny, which are two other scenarios, you're going to create more totalitarian societies where people in general are less free. And that is going to have repercussions to all sorts of other issues in our society, how we treat other people. It has repercussions on the level of violence in a society. It has repercussions on how we treat environment, nature, and so on and so forth. So that's kind of the research I've done a little bit more, because, you know, when we look at the futures of women, that is a difficult topic because we don't really know who women are. I mean, women are so diverse. There is such a diversity within that group. Certainly diversity with that group is almost as diverse as, you know, between that group and the group of men. At the same time, our societies insist on grouping us in that way. So that's a social practice that we have inherited and we need to work with.
But what is interesting is that the only reason why you're able to have this conversation, if you ask me, about gender and this kind of dichotomy of moving away from two genders to a whole variety of choices, is that because we are living in an era where people can actually choose to change their gender. I don't know if 100 years away from before we could have had this conversation, because the assumption was that gender was a fixed physiological thing, and therefore any other interpretation of yourself was either a past life experience or some kind of psychosis. So the question then is, if we are saying that, and it's interesting that you did make that distinction, and I'm happy you did, because it's very important to sort of inform our conversation, not just for today, but how we talk about these things in the space, especially those of us who are working in these sort of government spaces and policy-making spaces, that we begin to actually hear ourselves say, it's a woman's issue, and then say, but is it a woman's issue really? Or is it that there has been a feminization attached to this? Now, we know for sure that certainly as somebody, myself, who have been doing most of my work in developing countries, that when we're looking at, say, a policy document around schools or healthcare, there's a certain access that might be different for women than for men. So in that context, as you look at supporting strategic foresight in government planning, and then not focusing on this country so much, but in your work, having worked with other governments, just put it out, how then can we say support this conversation on the futures of gender issues as they impact on the real challenges? Because we've isolated gender as the challenge, which might be so.
Yes.
But if we're talking about water scarcity or energy or access to health, and how we treat with a pandemic, how we treat the rules of law according to migrant rights, refugee rights, trade, narco trafficking, how we will treat in the future arising issues around ownership of the intellectual property of plant genome. I mean, how do you advise governments who are looking at these ideas, who are actually trying to look at these ideas, to think about the futures of gender then, and put it in the context, especially in the cases where you say they're not really focused on gender, but there might be a genderized experience of the challenge. How are you trying to get that expression in your conversations?
Okay, well, really it depends where you are and what you're doing. Okay, so we know from gender theorizing, that's what I was referring to, that's where it's gone. So that's why I was looking, when I look in the future, I look at the contemporary developments in gender theorizing. And we know that when you talk about gender theorizing, and when you look at, for example, feminist theory, there were many different approaches in feminist theorizing. It started with a liberal feminism in the Western societies in the context of women being disempowered, completely disempowered. They didn't have legal rights, they didn't have political rights, they didn't have rights to education, and so on and so forth.
Yes.
So liberal feminist goals were to give women equal access to education, economy, politics, etc. Now that approach is still relevant anywhere in the world where women are disempowered at that level.
Yes.
So you still can use arguments from liberal feminism, which is now probably over 100 years old, but in some parts of the world, it's still relevant. And in some parts of the world where those rights are disappearing and there is backlash, you can still use the same argument. So it really depends on where you are and what you're trying to achieve and what your goals are. In other places where you have reached certain level of gender equality, you actually want to rethink the whole system. And that is very difficult. That is very difficult because people then start getting really unsettled because you are starting to say, well, actually, our economy is not gender neutral. The whole economic system is based on masculine values. What you value as productive labor and what you value as unproductive is very gendered. I mean, some feminists like MP from New Zealand, now that you mentioned New Zealand earlier in our conversation, she made that point in 1980 saying that somebody sitting, a male person sitting in a nuclear bunker waiting to fire a missile is productive because he has a wage, and a woman who is working in love economy, she doesn't have a wage, so she's unproductive. So even when you have men and women going into military and men going into caring industries, that gendered nature of economy still remains. So then you are looking at cultural feminism, you're looking at the second wave, you're looking at certain different approaches to how we understand gender, because in that context, that is more relevant than just getting more women in certain areas of work. Then you want to go next step, you want to go step further, and you're saying, well, we want this because this type of system is hurting us all. It's hurting men who are being seen as one-dimensional providers, and is hurting women who are doing unpaid labor, but it's also hurting all of us because when women go into the areas that have traditionally been masculine, they have to have masculine gender. So you can see with women who are running for the office, they have to be tough, they have to be strong, they have to embody masculine qualities. At the same time, they have double standards. They also have to be feminine. So they have to be beauty objects. They still have to, they can't be too masculine looking. So they have to have appearance that is feminine, but behavior that is masculine. It's very interesting. I mean, you can't win in that situation.
We have to become schizophrenic. We really have to have both hemispheres of our brain operating at the same sort of a level of whatever that word is in order to be functional in this contextualization of what it means to be successful.
Yeah, well, traditional feminine qualities of care and nurturing and all that sort of stuff, they're completely pushed aside in masculine fields, let's say military or politics. It's all about winning. It's all about stamping on other people. It's all about embodying those traditional qualities that have been connected to maleness and masculinity. So when women enter those fields, and they do so more than men enter feminine fields, because masculine fields have traditionally been awarded more, when they enter those fields, they have to behave in a similar manner. So this is why cultural feminists have said, when women enter in large numbers, they will start transforming slowly but surely those fields to get them more balanced, not just in terms of how many women are working there, but the whole culture and the structure of those places. So that has been the argument in that context.
But I know we're out of time, but I do have to ask this question because this is really a lesson for me that I really can't pass up. I'm going to get you like this again, so I have to take you and I have you. So Let's extend a little bit our time and
You have been listening to Future Sense Now with Dr. Claire Nelson, brought to you by the Futures Forum. For more, please visit www.thefuturesforum.org. Thank you for listening. Spread the word. Share the future.